Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
Good morning, I'm Karl Fitzpatrick and welcome to Business Matters. Well, this week saw the opening of the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge in New Ross. Similar to the Enniscorthy bypass, this is another significant positive development for the county, and we look forward to the economic benefits that this critical infrastructure will bring over the coming years. Well, the new national minimum wage comes into effect today and sees the hourly rate increase to €10.10, which represents the fifth increase over the past 5 years. The new rate was recommended by the Low Pay Commission, and the chairperson of the commission, Donal de Buitleir, joins me now to discuss the latest increase. Donal, you are the chairman of the Low Pay Commission, but before we discuss the work which is undertaken by the commission, perhaps you can tell us about your own background.
Yeah, I was a civil servant for 18 years and then I joined the private sector, did a lot of work for the public sector. I was on the H&D board for 5 years, did a lot of work on the Commission on Taxation in the early 80s. Basically an economist by background, and that's how I got involved in this.
So for those of our listeners that might not be familiar with the work of the Low Pay Commission, what is its objective?
Its main job is to make a recommendation to the Minister by the third Tuesday of July every year on what should be the minimum wage for the following year. Before it was fixed by political decision, what we try and do is look at all the evidence and make sure that we make the right decision that balances the interests of workers and doesn't damage employment or competitiveness.
And in terms of representation, which sectors or industry bodies currently sit on the Commission?
The Commission has 9 members, 3 people who understand the interests of employees, particularly those living on the minimum wage, and of the sectors where low pay and minimum wage workers are concentrated. There are 2 academics who have particular knowledge of economics and labour market economics in particular, and 3 people who understand the interests of employers, and I'm the independent chairman.
So what process is followed when the Low Pay Commission is determining whether changes should be made to the national minimum wage each year?
What we do is we have a research budget, and we've commissioned the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute, to do research to help guide us. We also have an extensive consultation programme. In other words, we ask people to send in their views. We meet various groups. We go around the country. We're in Waterford actually last year just to listen to people and see what their experience, both workers and employers. And also we look at a range of evidence, in particular things like, what are wages going, the rest of the economy, what's employment happening, what's happening, the exchange rate, currency, what's happening, productivity. Try and balance a range of factors to try and reach a sensible conclusion that benefits workers but doesn't damage the situation by creating lots of jobs or lots of hours.
And how important is international research in determining what particular recommendation you're going to make to government? For instance, Ireland has one of the highest minimum wages in Europe now.
It has, yeah. We're also, the cost of living here, though, is also one of the highest in Europe, so that's a factor to bear in mind. We particularly have an eye on what's happening in Britain, and last year the whole Brexit issue was very much in our minds, and the recommendation we made, which comes in today, the 1st of February, is that the minimum wage is increased by 30 cents per hour. That was made on the assumption that the British wouldn't crash out. In other words, that to be an orderly transition. If, for example, there was a hard Brexit or crash out, that would be we'd obviously have to look at that issue again. So we had to make an assumption about that, and that was the assumption we made.
As they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. On that basis, has the Low Pay Commission considered the indirect impact on employers of an increase in the minimum wage? For instance, where higher paid staff will be seeking the same increase as those on the minimum wage are receiving?
Yes, we're conscious of that. In fact, the research shows that people in the bottom quarter of the income of the wage distribution, there's some knock-on effect up to that level. It doesn't really affect people on higher earnings, but generally, if people are just above the minimum wage and it goes up, they obviously there is a knock-on effect, and that's something we're conscious of, and that's something that's often stressed in the submissions from employers.
And what other factors do you consider when a recommendation has been made in relation to the minimum wage?
Well, we're under the law, we're asked to look at changes in earnings during the period, looking at the exchange rate, what is happening in income distribution, whether employment is increasing or decreasing, or unemployment is increasing or decreasing. Generally, we have to look at productivity, some international comparisons, particularly with Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and any likely effect that the recommendation we make will have on levels of employment and unemployment, the cost of living, and national competitiveness. So what we're trying to do is actually strike a fair balance between the interests of employers and employees while trying to help as many people on low pay as possible.
And in terms of stakeholder engagement with employers, do you feel that the Low Pay Commission is doing enough to engage with stakeholders such as the Chambers of Commerce across the country?
Well, we have, in fact, on the current commission, there is a member of the staff of IBEC on the commission, who was appointed following a public competition by the minister. There's an open invitation to make submissions, and we meet employers groups every year. So I'm and also particular sectors like the low pay is concentrated in the main sectors of hospitality and retail.
And what type of feedback do you get from those particular sectors in that respect?
Well, we get a whole range of issues that from employers that costs are going up, insurance costs, that it's difficult to they point out their difficulties. They try and make sure that we're conscious of the difficulties of doing business in the current environment. And what we try and do is balance that with the other side, who come in and say, well, look, it's very hard to live on this money, and can you have to do something about it.
And how much pressure comes on the Low Pay Commission by government in relation to increasing the minimum wage?
None, and if there was pressure, I would completely ignore it. The government can actually accept or reject our recommendation, but if they reject it, they have to say why. They have to explain to the Dáil why they have. And so far, I think we've made 5 recommendations, and they've all been accepted.
And during the latest review process, a recommendation was made to increase the minimum wage. Why was this decision taken based on the fact that there's so much uncertainty facing Irish businesses today, from Brexit to international trade issues?
Well, what we did was the recommendation was based on the assumption that there would be an orderly transition with the UK leaving the European Union. Now, what this means is that up to the 31st of December this year, things will stay as they are. So it's actually pretty certain. We'll obviously take account of, in looking at it, when we make a recommendation next July, we'll obviously have a look at the situation and take into account any uncertainty that's there.
And Donal, on that basis, if it transpires that Brexit has a significant negative impact on our economy, would the Low Pay Commission consider making a recommendation to government to reduce the national minimum wage?
That hasn't arisen. In fact, since we've been set up, the economy has been going quite well. Employment has been going quite strongly. And if, for example, there was a severe reduction in employment, serious job losses, that might be something to be considered. But that would have to be very carefully considered, because actually cutting low people's wages could actually make the situation worse, because it would reduce spending power. So while it's in principle, I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't necessarily think it's likely.
And when a recommendation is made to increase the minimum wage, what metrics are used to decide on a new rate?
Ultimately, it becomes a matter of some judgment. What we're trying to do is actually change it incrementally, have no big shocks to the system. For the first year, there was an increase of 50 cents. Because it hadn't been changed for 6 or 7 years. The following year it was 10 cents, following year 30, 25, 30. So they're sort of incremental changes.
Now, employers may feel that increasing the minimum wage is another burden on top of their growing obligations. How would you respond to that?
we recognise that there are all sorts of other pressures on business, and what we try and do is be balanced and reasonable about it. But just because other costs are coming up, it doesn't necessarily mean that low-paid workers should bear the full burden of that.
Is there a possibility at some stage in this process that Ireland just becomes uncompetitive?
There is always a possibility that Ireland becomes uncompetitive, and that's something we have to watch. We have to seriously watch. And but so far, there's no evidence that that's the situation. The economy is growing extremely strongly.
Now, the increase that's coming in from today is a 30-cent increase to the minimum wage, bringing it up to €10.10. Now, over 127,000 workers will benefit from the increase. But I suppose, again, from an employer's perspective, could this increase actually hamper business growth or even cause small SMEs to close?
I'm not saying that nobody would decide to round up their business, but also there's the factor is that, like, for someone who works on 39 hours, which is the standard working week, this is worth $11.70 per week. So the spending power that's actually generated from that, is something that actually is a positive for business. If people are doing well, or doing better, that money goes round, comes round.
But to the employer, that equates to over €600 per year of an additional cost per employee that's on the minimum wage. It's considerable.
That's right. It is, yeah. No, it's not. It's not. But in the situation, like average weekly earnings last year were going up by just 3.4%. Hourly earnings are about 4%. The minimum wage the increase in the minimum wage is 3%. So it's not the minimum wage is not in this current recommendation not going up any faster than wages generally.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Donal de Buitleir, chairperson of the Low Pay Commission, and I would like to thank Donal for joining us on this morning's programme.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast